It's a quiet Sunday evening in Beverly Hills, California. The year is 1989, the kind of night where the palm trees sway gently in the breeze and the city seems to glow under the warm orange hues of a fading sunset. In the grand Mediterranean-style mansion on Elm Drive, the Menendez family is home. Hi everyone, and welcome back to The Haunting Chronicles, a podcast purely dedicated to diving into the dark side of the world where we cover all things mysterious, criminal, and haunting. I'd just like to add a disclaimer that this podcast is recommended for mature age listeners. Listener discretion is advised. From outside, their life is nothing short of a picture-perfect dream. Jose Menendez, a wealthy entertainment executive, is a man who climbed the ladder of success with relentless determination. His wife Kitty is elegant, poised, a former school teacher who now dedicates her days to her family. Their two sons, Lyle and Eric, are the embodiment of privilege, young, handsome, and destined for greatness. But tonight, as the world sleeps, a nightmare is unfolding behind those gilded walls. By the end of the night, Jose and Kitty will be dead. Shotgunned to death in their own living room. Jose shot 6 times and Kitty shot 10. It appeared Kitty was trying to crawl away before being fatally shot. And soon, the entire nation will find itself gripped by one of the most shocking murder cases in modern history. When the 911 call came in at 11:47 p.m., Beverly Hills police officers rushed to the scene. The call was made by Lyle Menendez, the elder son, his voice frantic and trembling with panic, as he screamed, "Somebody killed my parents." Officers arrived at the Menendez mansion to find a gruesome scene. Jose Menendez, 45, was slumped over the couch, his body riddled with shotgun wounds. Kitty, who was 47, laid nearby, her face barely recognizable after the brutal murder. As police began their investigation, one thing stood out. That was there was no shell casings left at the scene, meaning the killers had time to cover their tracks. One investigator stated, "I've seen very few murders that were more savage than this one." The brothers stated that they came home from the movies and found their parents dead. The police did not suspect the son's involvement at this time, but something didn't add up. Lyle and Eric, the grieving sons, were visibly shaken, but there was no signs of forced entry, no stolen valuables. The crime scene felt staged. Still, the initial theory was that of a home invasion gone wrong. Police began their investigation, looking into possible enemies of the Menendez family. As Lyle had stated, he believed that it was a mafia hit due to Jose's business connections. In the days that followed, the brothers became the center of public sympathy. 2 young men, suddenly orphaned, left to navigate life without the parents who had given them everything. They appeared devastated, barely holding themselves together. But then there were the shopping sprees. Lyle brought a Rolex watch, a Porsche, and a business. Eric splurged on private tennis lessons. Within just weeks, the brothers spent over $700,000 of their parents' money. The media started asking questions. Was this grief or guilt? Behind the scenes, detectives were working tirelessly to piece together what really happened that night. This spending caused police to begin to consider the brothers as suspects, with a possible financial motive. Family members of the brothers disputed a connection between their spending and the murder of their parents, asserting that there was no changes in their spending habits after the killings. But it wasn't till a shocking confession months later that the case took a turn no one could have predicted. Eric's high school friend, Craig Crennell, reported to police that Eric had confessed to him that the brothers had killed their parents. He also revealed that he and Eric had previously written a 66-page screenplay titled Friends, which depicted a son killing his wealthy parents for their inheritance. In an attempt to get a confession, police arranged for Craig to wear a wire during a lunch with Eric. However, during this lunch, Craig asked Eric whether he had killed his parents, and Eric denied it. Police also heard from Lyle's friend, Glenn Stevens, that 1 week after the killings, Lyle had made a sudden trip back home from Princeton to destroy something in the family computer. Stevens said that Lyle told him a family member found a new will and I went there to erase it. A computer expert hired by Lyle also said he was hired to ensure deletion of the new will. Apparently, this new will Jose had prepared left the boys with no inheritance. To the world, the Menendez family was the American dream. Jose Menendez, the patriarch, had carved out a remarkable career in the entertainment industry, rising from humble beginnings in Cuba to become one of Hollywood's most successful executives. His wife Kitty was a devoted mother and partner, standing by his side as they built their empire. But behind the closed doors of this Beverly Hills mansion, there were cracks in the foundation. Eric eventually confessed to his psychologist, Jerome Ozil, in vivid details about the murder of his parents. Eric couldn't deal with the guilt any longer, and he thought he was safe telling his psychologist due to doctor-patient confidentiality, which was true to an extent. Even though the psychologist Jerome didn't inform police of the killing, Jerome had told his mistress at the time. Right after the first initial confession, Jerome began recording his sessions with Lyle and Eric, which was believed to have been for blackmail. However, Jerome stated that it was for his own safety. As time went on, Jerome had broken up with his mistress. His mistress was so angered by the breakup that she went to police saying that Jerome had kidnapped and raped her, and that he had the confession tapes of the Menendez brothers murdering their parents. Within the investigation, it was also discovered that on the night of the murders, immediately after the killings, both brothers remained in the house for a few minutes, expecting the police to respond due to the noise of the gunshots. They left to dispose of their clothes that were stained with blood and later buried their shotguns. They also went to a movie theater and attempted to purchase tickets for the film Batman to use as their alibi, but abandoned this plan due to the timestamp on the ticket stub. They then headed to the Taste of LA festival. After returning home and finding no police presence, Lyle called 911, saying that he had just come home and discovered their bodies. Eric was heard screaming and crying in the background. When the officers arrived, Lyle and Eric ran from their home towards the officers while screaming. When the police first arrived, they did not seek gunshot residue tests from the brothers, which would have indicated whether they had recently discharged a firearm. Lyle and Eric both falsely told officers that they were elsewhere at the times of the killing. On the 8th of March, 1990, Lyle was arrested, while Eric turned himself in 3 days later after returning to Los Angeles from Israel. Both were held without bail and jailed separately at the Los Angeles County Jail. While in jail, police had done a search of Eric's cell and found a letter from Lyle talking about the murders and elaborating on why they did this. Lyle had written for Eric to destroy the letter, but Eric held on to it as he felt it was a way for him to connect to his brother. Their family members believed in the brothers' innocence, and so did many others, some even saying the boys looked too cute and innocent to have committed a gruesome crime. However, due to the mounting evidence against the brothers, they decided not to deny the murder of their parents, but rather explain why they did it. By 1993, the Menendez brothers had been behind bars for nearly 4 years. Their trial, actually 2 trials, had become a media spectacular. For the first time in American history, cameras were allowed inside a courtroom for a case of this magnitude. Millions of viewers tuned in daily, captivated by the drama unfolding on their screens. It wasn't just a murder trial, it was a front row seat to the unraveling of a family, layer by painful layer. The stakes couldn't have been higher. On one side was the prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Pamela Bosnack. She painted Lyle and Eric as cold, calculating killers who murdered their parents for their $14 million estate. On the other side, defense attorney Leslie Amberson sought to tell a different story. She argued that the brothers acted out of fear, not greed, that their father's abuse and their mother's neglect had pushed them into what she called a state of terror. It was a legal battle that would hinge on 2 very different interpretations of the same event. Eric stated in his trial testimony, "My father controlled everything. He told us who we could talk to, what we could wear, what we could eat. He wanted us to be perfect, or else." According to Lyle and Eric, life with Jose was a constant circle of fear and control, but their allegations went much deeper than harsh parenting. In the weeks following their arrest, both brothers claimed that Jose had sexually abused them for years. They described horrifying details, acts of violence and manipulation that began in early childhood and continued well into their teenage years. This revelation would change the entire trajectory of the case. For the defense, it was a critical piece of their argument that Lyle and Eric had acted out of desperation, not greed, that the murders were a response to years of unspeakable abuse. But their claims were met with skepticism. The abuse allegations were explosive. If true, they might explain why these young men felt so trapped. But providing those claims in court, that's a different story. The prosecution dismissed the brothers' testimony as fabricated, a convenient excuse for a premeditated crime. They argued that the abuse narrative was nothing more than a ploy to gain sympathy from the jury. Still, the brothers insisted that their father's cruelty and their mother's complicity had pushed them to the breaking point. Kitty Menendez, too, became a central figure in the trial. The defense painted her as a fragile, emotional, unstable woman who turned a blind eye to her husband's abuse. They described her as deeply depressed, struggling with addiction to prescription drugs and alcohol. Her journal entries introduced into court hinted at her despair. "I feel like I'm losing control. Jose is so demanding, and the boys, they're drifting further and further away. Sometimes I wonder if they even love me." Kitty's role in the family dynamic was complicated. To the brothers, she was both a victim and an enabler, a woman who suffered under Jose's dominance, but also failed to protect them. The brothers believed they were putting their mother out of her misery, a mercy kill, so to speak. But as the trial continued, public opinion began to shift. The graphic nature of the brothers' testimony shocked the nation. They described incidents of humiliation and violence in painstaking detail. They cried on the stand, the voices cracking under the weight of their stories. This was even reinforced with character witness statements made by people who also knew Jose. Not a single person besides Jose's secretary could say a nice thing about him. For some time, it was impossible to imagine young men inventing such horrific memories. For others, it was all too convenient. This trial wasn't just about murder. It was about power, control, and the secrets families keep. It forced the public to confront uncomfortable questions about abuse, privilege, and justice. But one question lingered above all. Were Lyle and Eric victims or cold-blooded murderers? In court, the prosecution laid out a meticulous timeline arguing that the murders were planned weeks in advance. The evidence was damning. Receipts showing that the brothers had purchased shotguns 2 days before the murders. The brothers had travelled over 100 miles to Santiago to purchase the guns with fake ID in the hope they wouldn't be tracked back to them. Secondly, the testimony from a friend who claimed Eric confided in him about wanting to kill his father. And of course, thirdly, the secretly recorded tapes from Dr. Jerome Ozel's office, Eric's therapist, capturing Eric admitting to the crime. Recorded on one of the tapes was Eric saying, "I shot my father, I shot him." Dr. Ozel, how did it feel? Eric, I was scared, but relieved it was finally over. The defense attorney Leslie, her strategy was bold. She put the brothers on the stand, allowing them to testify in their own defense. Leslie, during the trial, stated, "You will hear things in this courtroom that are difficult to listen to, but I urge you to remember, this is not a story of greed. This is a story of survival." For days, the boys recounted stories of abuse so graphic and disturbing, many viewers couldn't believe what they were hearing. Eric continued in his trial testimony, stating, "He would come into my room at night. I didn't know how to stop it. I was afraid of what he would do to me if I said no." Lyle and Eric described years of sexual, physical, and emotional abuse at the hands of their father, Jose. They claimed that their mother, Kitty, not only knew about the abuse, but chose to ignore it. The defense argued that on the night of the murders, Jose had threatened to kill them if they revealed his secrets. They believed their lives were in immediate danger. The day before the murders, Jose and Kitty had taken the boys out on their family boat. The brothers were convinced that this was the day they would die. So riddled with fear and paranoia, the brothers decided tomorrow would be the day they kill their parents. The brothers' testimony split the nation. Some saw them as victims of unimaginable trauma, pushed to the edge by a lifetime of suffering, while others saw them as a spoiled rich kids exploiting the abuse narrative to escape justice. Many questions arose, one from the prosecution saying, why didn't they just move out from the parents' home, contact the police, or tell a family member? But Eric stated in his testimony that he couldn't run away as his father was a powerful man and he had stopped at nothing to make sure he was the one that raised his kids. Eric and Lyle thought killing them was the only way to survive. By the time closing arguments began, the courtroom had become a battleground. The prosecution urged the jury to focus on the facts. The shotguns purchased in advance, the carefully staged crime scene, the $700,000 spending spree that followed. It was clear, they argued, that the brothers had planned the murders to secure their inheritance. Prosecution stated during trial, Lyle and Eric weren't afraid. They were angry. Angry that their father controlled their lives, angry that they weren't free to live the life they wanted, and they solved that problem the only way they knew how, with violence. But the defense painted a very different picture, one of two young men who were not just victims, but survivors. Leslie stated, Ask yourselves this: would you sit silently and do nothing while your life was in danger, or would you fight back? After months of testimony, the case went to the jury, and for weeks the nation held its breath waiting for a verdict. But then, when the decision came in, it wasn't the resolution everyone expected. Deadlock. Both juries, one for each brother, were hopelessly divided. Some jurors believed the brothers' story of abuse. Others were convinced that this was murder for profit. The result was a mistrial, leaving Lyle and Eric's fate hanging in the balance. By 1995, the brothers were back in court. Their first trial had ended in deadlock. Two juries unable to agree whether Lyle and Eric were cold-blooded killers or broken young men acting out of desperation. The mistrial had left the nation divided, but the retrial was very different. This time, there were no cameras in the courtroom, no daily broadcasts, no live commentary. The focus shifted away from public spectacle back to the law. And it was here, in the quiet of the second trial, that the fate of Lyle and Eric's was finally decided. The retrial began in October 1995. Once again, the brothers faced charges of first-degree murder, but this time the prosecution came prepared. Their goal was to strip away the emotional weight of the abuse allegations and focus solely on the facts. The shotguns purchased 2 days before the murder, the staged alibi as the brothers went to the movies after the killings, and the lavish shopping sprees in the months that followed. But there was one critical difference in this trial. Judge Stanley Weisberg, who was presided over the case, made a controversial ruling. The defense would not be allowed to present as much evidence of the brothers' alleged abuse as they had in the first trial. Without the abuse narrative, the defense was left with a much weaker case. It was like cutting the heart out of their argument. Still, Leslie, the defense attorney, and her team fought hard. They argued that the brothers acted out of fear, that years of abuse had left them emotionally broken and unable to see any way out. But with the judge's restrictions in place, the defense struggled to generate the same level of sympathy they had in the first trial. The brothers didn't testify this time. Instead, their lawyers focused on poking holes in the prosecution's narrative. But the weight of the evidence and the brutal nature of the murders was difficult to overcome. After months of testimony, the case went to the jury, and on the 20th of March 1996, they reached a verdict. Both brothers were found guilty of murdering their parents. The jury also determined that the murders were committed for financial gain, a special circumstance that made the brothers eligible for the death penalty. But instead of death, the judge sentenced Lyle and Eric to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For many, the verdict brought closure to a case that had haunted the nation for nearly 7 years, but for others, it raised uncomfortable questions. Were Lyle and Eric cold-blooded killers, or were they victims of a system that failed to protect them? Did the judge's decision to limit evidence of abuse tip the scales unfairly? And ultimately, can two truths coexist, that the brothers were both victims and perpetrators? Today, Lyle and Eric remain incarcerated, serving their life sentences. Over the years, they've continued to insist that their actions were the result of a lifetime abuse. The Menendez case still divides us decades later, but even prison could not sever the bond between them, or the shadows of the crimes that had brought them there. Initially, the brothers were sent to separate prisons. Lyle was housed at Mule Creek State Prison, while Eric was sent to California Correctional Institution. For years, they had no contact, relying on letters and phone calls to maintain their connection. Despite their isolation, both brothers tried to find purpose behind bars. Lyle, always the protective older sibling, became a mentor to younger inmates. He joined self-help groups and worked to improve the conditions within the prison. One former inmate stated, "Lyle was the guy you could talk to. He didn't judge. He just wanted to help people make it through." Eric, on the other hand, focused on his own mental health. He attended therapy sessions and found solace in writing. For years, he worked with a pen pal group, corresponding with people outside the prison walls. In 2018, after more than 2 decades apart, the Menendez brothers were finally reunited. A routine administrative decision brought Eric to Mule Creek State Prison, where Lyle had been incarcerated for years. Their reunion was emotional. One witness stated, "They hugged for what felt like forever. They were crying, both of them. It was like watching a family come back together." Since then, Lyle and Eric had been able to live and work together within the same facility. They spent their days reflecting on the past, but also looking for ways to move forward. For Lyle and Eric, it means using their story to help others. Over the years, they've spoken about the dangers of unchecked abuse and the importance of mental health. Through interviews and advocacy, they tried to shed a light on the darker realities that shaped their lives. In the early 1990s, the trial dominated headlines, captivating a nation hungry for drama. It was one of the first true crime stories to unfold on live television, and it changed the way we consume crime stories forever. For years, the Menendez brothers remained fixtures in pop culture. But the public perception of the brothers began to shift in the 2010s, thanks to the rise of streaming platforms and true crime media. Documentaries like Menendez Blood Brothers and the Menendez Murder series reintroduced the case to a new generation. They examined the brothers' claims of abuse with a more sympathetic lens, leading many viewers to question the fairness of their trial. Social media also played a role, with hashtags like Free the Menendez Brothers gaining traction on platforms like TikTok and Instagram. The renewed interest even sparked calls for a retrial, with supporters arguing that the brothers deserve a chance to present their abuse claims without restriction. But so far, their efforts have been unsuccessful. It's a story that continues to evolve as new generations revisit the case and ask, what does justice really mean? For nearly 3 decades, the Menendez brothers had lived behind bars, serving life sentences without the possibility of parole. But now a surprising twist has emerged in their story, one that could lead to their release in 2024. In October of this year, Los Angeles County District Attorney George Gascon announced his recommendation to re-sentence Lyle and Eric. He argued that their original sentence, life without parole, should be reduced to 50 years to life, which would make them immediately eligible for parole. The reasoning, a growing understanding of the long-term impact of trauma and abuse. He was quoted, "I believe brothers have paid their debt to society. Given their age at the time of the crime and their exemplary behavior in prison, resentencing is the right thing to do." Since their conviction in 1996, Lyle and Eric have been modeled prisoners. Both have worked to rehabilitate themselves, mentoring fellow inmates, seeking therapy, and using their story to raise awareness about abuse and mental health. But freedom isn't guaranteed. The resentencing process involves multiple steps. A judge must approve the recommendation, a parole board must evaluate their case, and finally, California Governor Gavin Newsom will have the final say. It's a complicated process, and some critics argue that the decision is politically motivated, tied to public interest sparked by recent documentaries and campaigns. But for others, it's a long overdue chance at justice. They are set to be retrialed in January 2025. If the Menendez brothers are released, it won't erase their crimes, but it may offer a new chapter to a story that has haunted and divided the public for over 30 years. The next few months will determine whether Lyle and Eric Menendez will walk free or remain behind bars for the rest of their lives. And that's a wrap on the Menendez brothers Lyle and Eric and the controversial case surrounding the murder of their parents, Kitty and Jose. Join us next time as we continue to explore the stories of the dark side of the world. Thank you so much for listening, and if you like this podcast, remember to subscribe for more. And remember, stay together, stay safe. Bye for now.